So thank you so much. I just want to give a specific trigger warning for sexual violence, for interpersonal harm, and for state violence. And I want to invite everybody in the audience to do what you need to keep safe, knowing those are in this conversation. I also want to label that the people, the names and details about people in this talk have been changed to protect them. Whenever I share that I'm a prison abolitionist, I'm asked the exact same question. It's a conversation that I've had hundreds of times at this point, and regardless of the environment, regardless of the audience, regardless of how much they do or don't buy in, I'm always asked the exact same question without fail in response. But what about the murderers and the rapists? We as a society are slowly coming to terms with the fact that our prison system simply does not work, or rather that it works exactly as it was intended to warehouse mental illness, criminalize trauma, and punish poverty. And most centrally, of course, as an extension of slavery. And yet, even those who are aware that what we're doing is not working are hesitant to condemn the entire system. Because what about the violent crimes, the ones with the victims? Sure, some people deserve a second chance, but other people need to be locked up, right? When people hear abolition, they envision burning buildings and anarchy, think that prison bars and barbed wires are what keeps our most vulnerable safe from our most dangerous. But what if I told you that we've got it all wrong? That our prison system is the most insidious predator of all, and that it is packed full of survivors. You see, supporting prison abolition and supporting survivors are not at odds in the way we might think. In fact, abolition is the singular most survivor-centered response to harm that we have. Long before I had the language of abolition, I had the experience of addressing harm in a restorative way. My first job out of college was working as a counselor at a residential program. Randomly, I was placed in the Sexualized Behaviors Program, a residence specifically for young men who were system involved due to a history of inappropriate sexual behavior. I was excited to have my first full-time job and didn't think much of it. They tell you not to pick favorites, but of course we all have them. Every counselor knows that there are certain clients that just stick to your soul in a special way. Like Anthony. Anthony was the most magnetic and chaotic child I had ever met. He was 15 years old and a petite kid, 5'0" with big brown eyes just dripping in eyelashes, but with energy big enough to fill any space he was in. When Anthony was in a bad mood, the entire room went up in flames. But when he was in a good mood and smiled one of his genuine toothy smiles, the whole world sparkled. He was also one of the most traumatized kids I'd ever worked with. Though he was all boast and bravado during the day, at night he removed the mask and he shared pieces of his shattered reality. Watching his mom drink herself unconscious, going for days without food, being locked in the basement with his siblings, DCF getting involved, being shipped from one foster home to the next, being touched without consent. His short life was an endless cycle of abuse and neglect. Like many people who've struggled with trauma, Anthony had difficulty around sleep. And so we developed this special bedtime routine that included soft humming music, his favorite fuzzy blanket, and me sitting in the doorway until he fell asleep. At night, I would see glimpses of the real Anthony, the little boy desperately seeking comfort, safety, and joy. I'll never forget when I learned why Anthony was in the program. Everybody else knew, had already read his file, but I like to get to know our clients first before reading their chart. And so we were months into our beautiful bedtime routine when I found out in a team meeting that Anthony had raped his sister. It didn't compute. I couldn't believe it. Were they sure they meant Anthony? I pictured him with his drowsy eyes smiling up at me from under his fuzzy blanket, and it didn't make any sense. Not only because it so deeply conflicted with the Anthony that I knew, but because it hit a nerve, triggered my own deepest trauma. When I was 20 years old, just a year before accepting the job at the residential program and meeting Anthony, I was raped by two strangers in an alleyway. When the incident happened, my tectonic plates shifted, and I lost pieces of myself. I felt a deep sadness and a deeper sense of shame and isolation. So I told no one, and I swallowed everything. When I found out about Anthony, all of my trauma came crashing back. The little box that I had so meticulously packed away was pulled to the surface and ripped open. After such a long time of intentionally repressing it, I was forced to face my trauma. I won't lie to you, at first, it was absolutely brutal. Trying to process my own sexual assault while being a counselor to people who had caused sexual harm to others challenged my empathy and my ethics. I cried a lot, both in work and out of work. I had my first panic attack and then a few more. I broke down physically, my body too heavy with all I was carrying, and had emergency back surgery at 22 years old. It was a painstaking, messy, and arduous point of my life, and I wasn't sure if I would make it through or what the other side would look like. But I learned that the greatest growth happens in the deepest spaces of discomfort. Though I was suffering, I was also living my way into an illuminating truth. As I processed my own trauma, I noticed this thin string that was tying all of my clients' stories together into an unmistakable web. Every single one of them had been a victim before their offense. Every single one of them was a survivor, just like me. It's a revelation that I brought with me into my next job working as a counselor in prisons. MCI Norfolk is Massachusetts' largest state prison, a medium security facility south of Boston housing around 1,500 incarcerated men, about half of whom are serving a life sentence. During my time at Norfolk, I worked with hundreds of clients, including a large number of murderers and rapists. Like Dante. Dante was tall and slim and could always be seen wearing tight braids and a soft smile. He was in his late 30s and 15 years into serving a life sentence for second-degree murder. 5 minutes into our first ever counseling session, Dante completely broke down. The levees burst and he sobbed, recalled watching his stepfather beat his mother, attempting to intervene and landing in the hospital, confiding in an aunt and being told to stop crying and be a man. I watched as he crumpled in half in front of me and his tears bounced off of the linoleum floor. When his sobs steadied to hiccups, he looked up at me and said, "Thank you. There's nowhere safe to do this in here." As Dante shared, I watched him melt from man to boy before my eyes, and I saw Anthony. I saw the end result of generational trauma, of untreated wounds, of deprived community. I also saw myself. I could feel how long he had been holding his story in, knew firsthand how saying it aloud for the first time felt like chewing on glass. In that moment, it became crystal clear. This was not perpetrator talking to victim. This was two survivors breaking bread. As wild as it might sound, I don't think I would have ever been able to address what happened to me without the help of my clients. My sexual assault was senseless and disgusting. I came out of it with this deep fear of evil people like my assaulters, the ones who wait in the shadows ready to attack. And yet, in working with my clients, I was able to break down this notion of evil and see it for what it really is, a manifestation of pain. Healthy, supported people don't do evil things. Once I was able to detach from this misinformed notion of evil, I was able to cultivate hope again. Evil transformed from a cause into a result. This meant that work could be done to intervene, that people were not lost causes or destined to do harm, but in need of nurturing and resources. Rather than ever feeling afraid of my clients, they actually gave me back my sense of safety. In working with them, learning their stories, and supporting their struggles, I learned how to empathize with myself again. They gave me the context that helped me move from demonizing people to demonizing pain. I've been working in jails and prisons for over a decade now and have come across hundreds of Anthonys and Dantes. Each person has a story that is uniquely theirs, but painfully the same. Prison is saturated with survivors who the system serves only to violate again. As a survivor myself, I can't help but notice that rape culture and prison culture are one and the same. Both are hyper-violent, thrive off of toxic masculinity and white supremacy, and work very intentionally to keep those with privilege and power while the marginalized are left voiceless. Both use shame and isolation as a tactic to discourage people from banding together and building community. When you buy into the prison system, you fuel these forces. How can we hope to address these issues with a system that replicates them? How can we say we support survivors when we subject people to state violence that creates even more of them? Over 90% of people in prisons and jails will return to the community one day. This means that the people we lock up will soon be our neighbors again. Rather than addressing any of the underlying causes of harm, prison serves only to exacerbate them. As one of my clients put it, the only thing I've learned in here is how to be a better criminal and a better fighter. That doesn't sound like safety to me. People do not heal in cages. Abolition seeks to interrupt these cycles both interpersonally and systemically. Abolition thinks about safety in a holistic and sustainable way. Rather than focusing on the individual, abolition steps back and looks at the community, paying less attention to the bad apples and more to the roots of the tree. How might our reaction to crime shift if we understood harm as the result of unmet needs? How might our systems of accountability change if we understood violence as an expression of pain? Abolition seeks to repair instead of punish. This does not mean excusing harm. No, abolition is deeply rooted in accountability. But what this means is addressing harm in a way that actually stops it from happening again. What this means is addressing harm in a way that is community-centered and survivor-led. This work might seem overwhelming or overly imaginative, but it's far from new. Indigenous cultures have been practicing non-carceral responses to harm for thousands of years. There is an abundance of brilliant Black feminist scholars like Angela Davis and Miriam Kaba who have been studying and advocating for abolitionist policy for decades. There are nations and communities all over the world who model for us what non-punitive justice systems can be. As abolitionist scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. We don't have to have an exact understanding of what this future will look like to know that what we're doing is not working and it's time to build something new. The reason that I talk about abolition so much, the reason that I bring it into every single space that I'm in is because it's my responsibility. And now it's all of yours too. If we seek to hold those who are responsible for violent interpersonal harm accountable, then we also must hold ourselves accountable for the deeply violent and feudal system that we uphold, enable, and perpetuate. We must look closer at the things that we cling to in the name of safety and ask if they're actually helping or just causing more harm. We are all responsible for creating a safer community. Our harm and our oppression have the same roots, and so our shared healing and liberation must grow towards the same light. Because abolition does not mean tear it all down. It means build something more beautiful for all of us, even the murderers and the rapists. Thank you.